Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome, my dear faves, to the first part of What If Ichigo is Sent Back in Time to Befriend Young Aizen for World Peace? Chapter 1. Ichigo, Soul Society is in a real pickle since Aizen's last attack after he escaped from prison. Urahara leaned against a table in his lab. If he combines forces with Yuha Bak, we may not be able to survive. He adjusted his striped hat, opened his fan and fluttered it back and forth. Ichigo scowled. So what else is new? I'm doing everything I can, but even powered up I'm still not up to his level, unless I work with others. Exactly. Urahara shut his fan with a snap and grinned. You and I need to work together again. He gestured at what looked like a huge machine covered in a drop cloth. Which is why I built this special machine just for you, so you can solve all our problems. Quote. Fine. But what does it do? The shopkeeper patted the machine proudly. I've figured out exactly what it's going to take to stop this war with Aizen, and that you are the only one who can do it. I get that, Ichigo said. How is this machine going to let me do that? Good. I'm glad you've already agreed to participate. Of course it's still in the experimental stage, but I'm sure none of those little software and hardware bugs will be a problem. Urahara whipped the drop cloth off the machine and fiddled with a dial. The machine began to emit a loud hum. Crackles of electricity and long sparks zipped from one end of an electrode to another. Said Ichigo, looking a little nervously at the device. Exactly what did you say this thing does? Quote. Step right up. Urahara gestured to a large metal plate at the rear of the device. It won't hurt a bit. Or at least not very much. If you survive, that is, he added, twisting another dial and frowning over a readout. Ichigo rolled his eyes. Whatever. He stepped onto the plate and loosened Zangetsu in its sheath. So what am I supposed to do? Quote. I've completed my psychological analysis of Aizen's personality, and fed the results into the supercomputer I built last week. He frowned at a display on the side of the machine and tapped it with one finger. He scowled when nothing happened, and rapped on the display sharply with his fan. An array of lights immediately popped into existence, winking in an elaborate pattern. Just what it needed, a carefully calibrated percussive input. Yes? Demanded Ichigo. You were saying about your psychological analysis of Aizen's personality. Of course I'm only a humble shopkeeper and not a psychiatrist, so don't hold me responsible, but you see, based on what you yourself told me when you crossed swords with him, he was lonely. You said that ever since he was very young, he always had far more power than everyone around him, and that he was always searching for an equal. Then he finally gave up on ever finding someone like that and decided that instead, he would take over the world. Right, so what did you say I had to do to stop him? I'm getting to that, don't be so impatient. You kids. Everything has to be done yesterday. He laughed loudly as Ichigo stared at him in mounting annoyance. That's a joke, Ichigo. You'll see in a moment. Lighten up. He flipped a few more switches and the ominous hum increased in volume. Good, I think it's going to work after all. He straightened and peered at Ichigo from under his hat. Here we go. Quote. A bright light began to glow around Ichigo, making it hard for him to see or hear anything that was going on in the lab. Hey! he shouted, as sparks arced up all around him. "Hurry up and tell me what I'm supposed to do." Quote, "All right, calm down. What I've done here is build a time machine." "A what?" "Time machine. No self-respecting scientific genius can be without one. This will be the crowning achievement of my career. At last everyone will forget all about the previous failures. Well, we won't go into that." He paused in his adjustments of the levers and buttons to gaze off into the distance. The lights and noise around the machine intensified. From atop the glowing plate, Ichigo interrupted. "Will you stop blathering and tell me what's going on?" Urahara started. "Ah. All you need to do is go back in time to when Aizen was a boy. Get to know him, since you're the only one with the power to be his equal, and befriend him. Let him know that this whole trying to be a god thing is a bad idea." Problem solved. He tipped his hat down over his eyes. "I really am a genius." "What? Befriend Aizen? What the fuck? The guy's an evil scumwad." Ichigo shouted. "How can I make friends with someone like that?" Quote, "Oh, you can do it, Ichigo." Urahara waved his fan again. "The fate of the universe hangs in the balance." "No!" shouted Ichigo, almost completely obscured by sparks. He crossed his arms. "I won't do it." The shopkeeper looked nonplussed for a few long seconds. Then he heaved a sigh. "Well then," he rubbed his chin. "I've got it. You had to do it to protect your friends." Quote. Tufts of Ichigo's orange hair stood on end, and he scowled and uncrossed his arms. "Well, in that case then." An expression of extreme resolve appeared on his face, and he unlimbered his sword and got into a ready stance. "I'll do it. But, how does one make friends with someone like Aizen?" "That's easy, Ichigo," Urahara declared. "All it takes for you to save the world is, give Aizen a hug. That's all he needs." The light around the platform flared more brightly than ever, and the crackling intensified. With a loud bang, all the lights went out. A few moments later, the emergency generators kicked in and dim lights came on all over the lab. The platform was empty. XXXXXXX. On A1234. And A1234. The Shinigami Academy drill sergeant bellowed. "Keep going, ya maggots." Quote. Ichigo grunted. The old-time training methods they used in the past were already getting pretty annoying. But he had managed to complete the first part of his mission correctly. He'd found himself in the forest outside Seireiti, asked for directions to the academy, presented himself as a Shinigami candidate in training, and, after much head-scratching and moaning over paperwork by academy officials, had been admitted. The way they ran things here, it was surprising Aizen hadn't snapped earlier. The entire academy was extremely regimented, with no allowances made for individual differences or advanced skills. Unlike in Ichigo's time, everybody had to complete the full 6-year course regardless of ability. For Ichigo, placed in first-year classes and forced to learn basic techniques he had already mastered long ago, it was pure torture. At least he had made contact with his target. Aizen looked like he was about 9 years old, but there was no missing his Ryotsu. It was overwhelming, even for someone at Ichigo's level. Other students frequently had to be removed from class whenever Aizen released his energy to perform an exercise. As a result, the boy had been ostracized, and was frequently punished by the teachers. In these days, imprisonment and corporeal punishment were common in the academy. After yet another scene where Aizen had completed a task that had knocked out about a dozen of his classmates and been hauled away in punishment, Ichigo asked if there was any way Aizen could be moved to a more advanced class or perhaps allowed to graduate early, since he was clearly an unusually gifted student. The Shinigami instructor snorted, "Gifted? His power appears high now, but it'll all even out by third year." He puffed out his chest. "Here at the Shinigami Academy, we believe that every candidate is gifted." Ichigo rolled his eyes. "Isn't that just another way of saying no one is?" Quote. "Silence," roared the instructor. 50 laps around the barracks for insolence. Quote. Of course, using Flash Step, Ichigo could complete that in about a minute, so it was a relatively ineffective punishment. Afterwards, he returned, not even winded, to the instructor who had barely finished speaking. The instructor glared at him, his face still red. "Well, since you and trainee Aizen seem to have the same ignorant, pig-headed views, you can join him for the night in the repentance cell." He gestured to 2 other trainers. "Guards, take him away." Quote. The boy was sitting in the corner of the cell when Ichigo arrived, thick, messy bangs flopping over his glasses. A frown on his face as he stared off into the distance, refusing to acknowledge his new cellmate. He was painfully thin, his wrists pale and lined with blue veins. His Shinigami outfit hung loose on his small frame. Bruises peeped out from under his collar. Ichigo sat down beside him. "Hey." The boy glanced at him and then away, but said nothing. Ichigo tried again. He indicated the bruises. "How'd you get those?" Quote. The boy shrugged. "I mean, I get bruised all the time during the workouts, but those look worse than usual." The boy responded with a huff of annoyance, not looking at Ichigo, "It's nothing. They'll fade as soon as I get out of the Ryotsu limiting area." His gaze returned to the far end of the room. Ichigo persisted. "Did you get them in training?" Quote. This time, intense brown eyes focused on Ichigo, eyes appearing larger than usual in the thin, pale face. A penetrating stare that appeared to take in everything about him. "No, the guards accidentally knocked me into the wall when they were bringing me here." He paused and looked Ichigo up and down. 7 or 8 times. Ichigo winced. "Does that happen a lot?" "Because I used to have the same kind of problems with bullies back in middle school." The boy shrugged. "It's unimportant. Can't you fight back?" Quote. "If I do, then I'll get expelled, and I need the degree." "It's only 6 years." Ichigo raised his brows. Apparently patience had always been one of Aizen's virtues. The boy looked around 9, but had to be no older than Ichigo's own age of 17, and 6 years seemed like a really long time to him. Nearly half his own lifetime. Well, if you weren't too good at math. If Aizen was already capable of making plans that involved accepting abuse for half a lifetime merely to get a piece of paper from the Shinigami Academy, no wonder he could plot for 100 years to become God. "What's your name?" Quote. The boy gave a long-suffering sigh as though he hadn't wanted to be engaged in conversation with a stranger, but was forcing himself to be courteous. "Aizen Sosuke. Pleased to make your acquaintance," he returned politely but with an edge of hostility. Ichigo suppressed a grin. At least the mask wasn't yet completely in place. "I'm Kurosaki Ichigo. Pleased to meet you. I just arrived here and entered the academy." Sosuke rolled his eyes. "I know. You showed up last week, and already the instructors are talking about your power levels. Not in 600 years have there been 2 first-year students with such destructive amounts of Ryotsu." Ichigo was impressed. "How do you know all that?" Quote. The boy appraised him coolly. "I watch and listen. It's not that hard. No one notices you when you're small and know how to hide." "I'm not too good at that." Ichigo ran a hand through his hair. wondering what abilities Aizen had already developed that he might be using for his clandestine information collecting activities. It seems people are always noticing me. Can't imagine why. Sosuke offered him a small grin and his eyes flicked to Ichigo's mop of bright orange hair. I've always wanted to learn how to be more unobtrusive, Ichigo said. You seem to do a good job of reining in your power when you want to. Care to teach me? Quote. Those all too sharp eyes examined him once again. Ichigo could almost hear the gears churning in little Sosuke's overpowered brain. Why should I give an advantage to someone who is likely to be my only competitor? Quote. Ichigo shrugged. Who knows, maybe I'll return the favor and help you someday. Sosuke looked skeptical, but then he mused, of course, it is boring sitting in here, being the only one singled out by the instructors. If I help you develop your powers, maybe some of their punishments will fall upon you. Ichigo smirked and lifted a shoulder. That seems like as good a reason as any other. Chapter 2. Ichigo sat in the classroom, trying to keep his jaws from cracking as he yawned. One thing hadn't changed in hundreds of years. Teachers were still boring. He peeked out the window. The late fall sky topped the buildings of the Shinigami Academy, hazy blue streaked with thin wispy clouds. Across the courtyard, a row of trees whipped back and forth in a stiff breeze. He rested his chin on one palm, trying to keep his eyes open. Maybe if he closed them just for a moment. Ichigo, said a gravelly voice, and Ichigo's eyes jerked open. His jaw dropped. In front of him stood Chad, Orihime, and Renji, all wearing Shinigami Academy uniforms. What are you doing here? He demanded. Renji threw up his hands. What did you expect from hat and clogs? It was an accident. We were all helping the mad scientist in his lab when Yoruichi, in cat form, jumped up onto his laptop. She stepped on a sequence of keys that activated the time machine, and, before we knew what had happened, we were all sent back here. But don't worry, Ichigo, said Chad. We're glad to be here. We can give you advice on your mission. I don't think giving Aizen a hug is necessary. You don't even need to talk to him much, just stand quietly by his side and offer him loyalty. Orihime piped up cheerfully, No, Kurosaki-kun. I think a much better idea is to make him something homemade to eat. Remember, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. She brought an elaborate concoction out from behind her back. Ta-da! My special pickle, rutabaga and chicken ice cream pie. She grinned proudly. Chicken ice cream? Groaned Ichigo. Inoue, are you sure? Quote. Don't worry, Kurosaki-kun, she announced cheerfully. I remembered to remove the feathers this time. She peered at a small protuberance sticking out of the crust and her face fell a little. Although, I may have forgotten a claw or two. She poked at the pie crust with one finger and her face lit up. But it's okay because it'll just add a crunchy surprise to the texture. Quote. There was a thud. Chad had gagged, passed out, and now lay sprawled full length on the floor. Renji looked like a Christmas tree, his face bright green under his equally bright red hair. Ichigo swallowed. Inoue, maybe this isn't. She beamed, holding out the pie. Give Aizen-san some of this, and I guarantee he won't betray Soul Society. Quote. Yeah, muttered Renji, because he'll have died from food poisoning first. He shoved his face up close to Ichigo's. No, what you need to do is whip his ass in a fight. That's the primary rule from the most authoritative reference ever, manga. First you fight with someone, Then you become their best friend. He scratched under his red ponytail. Well, unless you kill them, that is. Or unless they're the villain. A look of confusion crossed his face. Wait! You idiots! Shouted a voice from the window. Ichigo spun around. Rukia perched on the windowsill, arms folded, a very cross expression on her face. Don't you understand? Ichigo is the only one who can save the world by befriending Aizen. And Ichigo, you need to get off your ass and start doing something instead of just sleeping in class. She stopped abruptly and put a finger to her mouth. I just thought of the best idea. Let's get Aizen a Chappie plushie. That's it. She grinned triumphantly. It's clinically proven impossible to make evil plots to take over the world if you sleep with a Chappie plushie in your bed every night. Quote. Ichigo gaped at her, ignoring the Chappie comments. What do you mean by doing something? He asked. What am I supposed to be doing? Quote. Rukia rolled her eyes in exasperation. This. Without warning, her fist slammed into his face, along with a healthy dollop of spirit pressure that felt almost solid. Wake up, Ichigo. Quote. Ichigo jerked upright in his seat, eyes snapping open. His friends were gone, and the entire class had turned around in their seats and were staring at him, including Sosuke, sitting one row over watching him with a very faint smirk on his face. Bewildered, Ichigo rubbed his eyes. It must have been a dream. He must have fallen asleep in class and dreamed that his friends showed up in the Shinigami Academy. The teacher glared at him. Detention for you, Kurosaki. His lip curled in vicious satisfaction. Report to the sergeant for latrine duty this afternoon. Ichigo groaned under his breath and tried to scrub the sleep out of his eyes. He missed his friends. Seeing them had brought back a rush of emotions. Being thrown so far back outside of his own time made him feel like an alien, like everything his instincts normally told him had been turned upside down. Being sent on a mission to somehow befriend the most evil criminal Soul Society had ever known did not make for restful nights. It would have been great to talk with them again, even if their advice sucked. He felt a little sick to his stomach after seeing Orihime's pie, but that, too, was a familiar feeling. The bell rang, and everyone got up. Students slammed books into bags and a hubbub of conversation arose. Ichigo bent to get his bag from under his seat. Sosuke stood up, and two of the larger first-year students chose that moment to walk by. They bumped into him, accidentally. One knocked off his glasses and the other stepped on them. There was a loud crunching sound. Oops! Sniggered the bigger of the two boys. Sorry, said the other one insincerely. They shouldered their way out of the class, snickering. Sosuke glanced down at the shattered frames and bits of glass. His face appeared even younger and more vulnerable without his glasses, his eyes unfocused and vague. He sighed softly and opened his book bag. He pulled out a threadbare handkerchief and laid it on the floor. Kneeling, he picked up bits of broken lenses and twisted frames with his thin fingers and placed them carefully in the ragged square of cloth. Without a word, Ichigo slid to his knees and helped him collect the pieces. Sosuke met his eyes expressionlessly and returned to his task. Is there a shop or somewhere you can get those repaired or replaced? Ichigo asked. The boy looked away, his bangs falling over his face. Yes, he said quietly, there is a lens grinder in town. But it is expensive. He tilted his head. Surely there must be a Kido to return objects to their original state. However, I haven't been able to find a spell like that in any of the books in the library. Yeah, said Ichigo, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't think that's on any of the lists. Sosuke's eyes lit. There must surely be Kido beyond what we are taught. The academy limits us, you know, he whispered, lowering his gaze. I've heard about forbidden Kido, techniques that only some are allowed to practice. Ichigo frowned, thinking of what he had heard about Tessai and the use of forbidden Kido. Surely repairing objects wouldn't be forbidden? Quote. Sosuke shrugged and placed the handkerchief containing the wrapped remnants of his glasses carefully in his book bag. Look, why don't the two of us go after those guys? Ichigo said. We shouldn't let them get away with that. Go after them? Sosuke turned on him and the air crackled with spiritual pressure. Didn't you know? Takeo and Mitsuru come from noble families. If we fight them, we'll both be expelled. But you can't just let them get away with stuff like that. Otherwise they'll keep on bullying you. Quote. Sosuke stared up at him, his eyes bare and suddenly burning. His bangs fell to one side and Ichigo could see two small red marks on either side of his nose left by his glasses. Let them get away with it? His eyes narrowed. Do you think that I would let? Then his face shuddered. I can't do anything about it, and it doesn't really matter, he said softly. Let it go. He got to his feet and left the classroom, leaving Ichigo staring after him. What was it he had been about to say? Ichigo took a step out into the training yard for what had become their daily practice session. Sosuke stood motionless, his sword unsheathed, his face in shadow. Ouch! Ichigo yelled. A lash of Ryotsu had suddenly struck his face. He raised an arm defensively, a little too late, and Sosuke sighed. No, came the soft voice from across the yard. Use your energy to form a shield, not your body. Shit, Ichigo muttered as blood trickled down his face. He healed it and raised his mental shields. You enjoyed that, he accused. You're a sadistic son of a bitch. The only response was a quiet chuckle. You can't deny it makes for effective training. Ichigo growled, but then he thought back to how Urahara had trained him, and his dad, and said nothing. Sosuke moved forward into the light. Besides, it seems to me that you enjoy pain. What? Of course not, Ichigo retorted. No, he had thoroughly cussed out Urahara after Hat and Clogs had nearly killed him. Not to mention the way he put his goat-faced father in his place after his wake-up calls. He hated the way they treated him. The boy studied his expression. I saw you defending that trainee the other day. You have something of a hero complex, Ichigo, charging into a group of at least half a dozen bullies. Ichigo frowned. I just needed to protect her. What was it, 6 against 1? His face darkened. Unacceptable. And the way the academy looks the other way when nobles are involved? It has to be stopped. Sosuke gave a light laugh. Stopped by whom? Us? Don't be ridiculous. We have no power in the system. Actions such as you propose could only lead to exile or even death. Don't you know what happened to Nakamura Minori? Ichigo shook his head. He was a student here, a peasant from Inazuri. He attacked a noble last year and was expelled. They found him in the forest, dismembered. His killers were never found. They never even searched very hard. The word was that he got what he deserved. Well, what else can we do? Ichigo challenged, watching Sosuke closely. There was a momentary glint in his eyes, and then the boy shrugged. Wait. Go through the process, work our way up the ranks. One day we will be the people making the rules. Ichigo shook his head. I just don't have that kind of patience. That girl could have been killed while I waited. I had to save her now. My point exactly. What you do is not rational, so I've come to believe there must be some deep underlying need in you for self-immolation, to charge into a crowd of fists and swords that will surely inflict pain upon you. He tilted his head. Why? Do you feel you did something wrong in your life, something that deserves punishment, to make you such a masochist? Quote. Of course not, Ichigo yelled, pushing away the thought of when he had failed to save his mother. It's just the right thing to do, damn it. You should consider thinking about doing the right thing yourself. He glared at the boy who one day was going to cause so many deaths in pursuit of his own selfish desire for power. Sosuke laughed gently. You're protesting quite a bit, Ichigo. That's usually the sign I'm hitting a little close to home. Ichigo scowled. Why did so many of their discussions seem to turn out this way? He was 5 years older than Sosuke. The boy had admitted he was barely 12 years old. And yet, it seemed the younger boy always got the better of him. It wasn't just that his Ryotsu was powerful. With his intellect, he could think rings around everybody around him. Ichigo had to figure out how to get through to him. He shook his head as he left the training area, hurrying to his next class. He didn't seem to be making much progress. And he had a feeling that the younger boy was up to something. Exactly what, he couldn't put his finger on. He wished he had a friend to talk things over with. He ran into the classroom and grabbed the last seat. Their teacher was sick, and supposedly they had a substitute today. A sandaled foot appeared on the other side of the door. Then their substitute teacher came into view and turned to face the class. Ichigo's jaw hit the floor. Chapter 3. The classroom door opened and in walked Hiriko Shinji, wearing the uniform of a 6th-year academy student. Ichigo gaped as the future wizard grinned toothily at the class under neatly trimmed bangs, long blonde hair falling halfway down his back. He still looked exactly the same, the youthful face, the jaunty grin, only his hair was different, long and straight and glossy instead of in the pageboy cut he had worn when he showed up as a student in Ichigo's class in the world of the living so long ago. Would show up, in the future. Ichigo shook his head. This time travel stuff was confusing. In this time period, Shinji still had not yet been hollowified. He had not yet gone through that horrific night where Aizen had experimented on him and his friends and turned them into what they believed were monsters. He must still have had some innocence. He surely couldn't be the same cynical friend Ichigo had once known, relied on, fought beside. Ichigo tried to see if there was anything different in his face from the Shinji he remembered. Hey everyone. Sorry to inform you that your regular instructor was injured on a mission, and we're a little short-handed right now, so you guys get the only fully qualified teaching assistant in the academy. He jerked a thumb towards his chest and his grin spread to encompass even more teeth. That's yours truly. He turned to write his name on the board, and Ichigo rolled his eyes as he saw that he was writing the characters backwards. So that at least hadn't changed. Even hundreds of years ago, Shinji was telling the same jokes. Ichigo chuckled to himself. If he got back, when he got back, he was going to give his friend some good-natured ribbing about that. Now, I know you're studying the theory of military strategy in this class, but I've never been much of a theory kind of guy. Let's spice it up by talking about practical tactics in fight and hollows. He grinned again and began a series of rapid-fire drawings on the chalkboard. Now, hollows come in many shapes, sizes, and strengths, but the one thing we always know is, they're predictable. They're driven by hunger, pure and simple. They seek out souls to devour. They're simply not intelligent enough to evolve past instinctual behavior. Knowing this gives us our greatest weapon against them. Brains will always triumph over brawn. Ichigo snuck a glance at Sosuke, taking notes in his neat handwriting with a completely neutral expression on his face. He wondered if he was seeing the germ of the idea that would one day lead to Aizen's experimentation with hollows. After all, if your enemy had a fixed idea of what you were like, and then you changed, it could be a very powerful strategy to use against an opponent. Shinji made another joke, and most of the class laughed. However, Ichigo noticed that one corner of Sosuke's mouth twitched downward very slightly. So he already didn't like the older student. Did they have a previous history? What was it, after all, that had led Aizen to specifically target Shinji with his experimentation? Back in his own time, the wizard had told Ichigo in detail about the momentous night leading to their hollowification and exile. Aizen's remarks to him during that encounter had seemed incredibly personal to Ichigo. If you had interacted with me as other captains did with their lieutenants, you might have noticed something was wrong. The reason you're lying there right now is all thanks to the fact that you knew nothing about me. Now that Ichigo knew Sosuke, the words sounded a little bit sad, and certainly petulant, as though Aizen had been nursing a long-term grudge. But Shinji had never told Ichigo any details about his previous relationship with Aizen. Obviously he had never thought much of the man even before the events that day. "Alright!" shouted Shinji. "Now we're gonna hear your personal stories about contact with hollows. Who wants to start?" Quote. Sosuke, on the other side of the room from Ichigo, raised his hand. Shinji glanced right past him and pointed to a burly student behind him. "Hayashi, why don't you tell us about the last time you saw a hollow?" Quote. The student stuttered. "We were on a training exercise and one was hidden under a bush." He turned bright red and fell silent. "Well?" prodded Shinji. "What did you do?" Quote. "Me?" squeaked the student. "Nothing. When the hollow encountered you, did it try to hide? Evade your attacks? Outflank you?" Quote. "Nah. It just charged us, and then the teacher split its head in two." "And what about you? How did you react?" Quote. Hayashi gulped. He shit his pants," interrupted his neighbor, guffawing. Hayashi whipped his head around and glared, but fell into an embarrassed silence. Shinji snorted. Right. Moving on. What about you?" he said, pointing at another student, again ignoring Sosuke's upraised hand. He continued on through the class, driving home his point that hollows behaved instinctually and never showed signs of intelligence. After a few questions, Sosuke interrupted before another student could speak. "With all due respect, Hiriko-san, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." A look of distaste crossed Shinji's face. "Do y'all always have to sound like a dictionary, Aizen? And I don't recall calling on you. I'm merely pointing out the logical flaw in your arguments, Hiriko-san. It would be remiss of me to allow your misconceptions to influence the class." Shinji rolled his eyes. "Remiss. Misconceptions. Seriously, Aizen, get that stick out of her ass. The class laughed. Ichigo slapped his hand on his desktop with a loud crack. I've seen hollows showing signs of intelligence. He threw back his head and glared at Shinji. And why is Sosuke being singled out as the only one you didn't call on? Quote. Shinji looked Ichigo up and down with interest. You're the new student, Kurosaki Ichigo, isn't it? Quote. What if I am? Ichigo challenged. I've heard of you. Shinji waggled his eyebrows. He crossed his arms. So, enlighten us. What signs of intelligence have you seen? Quote. Ichigo hesitated. How much could he say? When he first arrived in the past, he had worried about disrupting the timeline until he realized his whole purpose in going back was to change things. He remembered his first encounter with Fishbone D, how his heart had pounded, and the expression on Rukia's face as he purified him. Still, most of the hollows he encountered in the early days did act like mindless beasts. Until Grand Fisher. There was one hollow I saw, he began, that used a lure on the top of his head to draw in victims. Shinji scoffed, but Sosuke looked fascinated. So? There's plants that grow something that looks like food to bugs, to lure him in. You're not saying that plants are intelligent, are you? Quote. This hollow could create a lure that appeared to be someone you knew. That indicates some kind of thinking, doesn't it? Quote. Someone you knew? You're saying this hollow could read your mind? Shinji appeared skeptical but also intrigued. Yes, Ichigo continued, wondering again if he was saying too much. His fingers could extend and pierce your body, extracting your memories. He was intelligent enough to sort through them and create a replica of someone you cared about. Shinji rocked back on his heels. Don't think I've ever heard of a hollow like that, he eyed Ichigo. Where did you say you encountered it? Quote. Does it matter? Demanded Ichigo. I'm just providing evidence that disproves your theory. What kind of teacher asks his students questions but then attacks them if they seem to be learning anything new? Quote. Shinji tipped a non-existent cap to Ichigo. I kinda like you, new guy. XXXXXXX. Sosuke caught up with Ichigo as they walked to their next class. That hollow you mentioned, he began, the lure looked exactly like a regular person? Quote. Yes, Ichigo said shortly. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to remember the hollow who had tricked him so devastatingly, didn't want to remember that day or any of the days afterwards. When he had been left alone, the center of his life gone, the sun forever set. Sosuke studied his face. Who was it that meant so much to you? Quote. Ichigo glared at him. He never liked personal questions. But he knew from experience that Sosuke was so curious that he wouldn't stop pestering him until he answered. It was my mother, all right? She died because of me. Sosuke raised his eyebrows. You have a family? He said it so neutrally, like someone who had no clue what the word family meant, who had no idea what it meant to lose a mother. Ichigo remembered the moment when he had crossed swords with Aizen, felt the bone-deep loneliness in his sword, felt the utter solitude of the man who had lived for hundreds of years. He had even gotten a glimpse of his inner world. In it, there were no buildings, no forests, no life. It was a desert more barren than Hueco Mundo. It was ironic that when Aizen had gone to the world that bore such a resemblance to his soul, he had built an artificial sun. Just as he had built an illusory self, a warm and caring man. But what was he now, at 12 years old? Was he even now cold and alone, lost in the empty desert that Ichigo still remembered? He never had a family, but why was he asking Ichigo about his? Why did he even want to know? He had noticed that Sosuke had been seeking him out more and more lately, had never once missed one of their training sessions. The boy never spent much time with anyone else, almost always preferring his books. "Yeah," said Ichigo at last. "Well, I had a family." Now, he shrugged. It occurred to him that he had no idea how to get back home. He had kind of hoped Urahara would pull another genius act out of his floppy hat, but realistically he knew there was no guarantee. He might never see his dad or his two little sisters again. He scowled at the other boy. "I had two little sisters, but as far as I know, they're gone. What about you?" Quote. It was Sosuke's turn to look away. "No," the boy said softly. "My earliest memory is of being a small child in Inazuri." Ichigo stopped. He didn't think Sosuke had ever revealed anything about his personal life before. "You never had anyone looking out for you, an adult or older kid?" Quote. Sosuke shrugged. In Inazuri, it was pretty much every man for himself. Every child for himself as well. Ichigo thought of Rukia and Renji's stories of growing up together on the streets. They had their own kind of family. Aloud, he said, "Weren't there other kids you could band together with?" Quote. "If they were bigger than me, they wouldn't want a weaker kid around. Conversely, why should I take in a weaker partner? What good would it do me? They would be nothing but weights around my legs, holding me down, and a handicap like that could kill you, on the streets of Inazuri. Do you look at everything in terms of what good it would do you?" Quote. "It's called survival. It's a matter of life and death to be rational. Why should I die because I allied myself with someone weaker?" Quote. Ichigo shook his head. "My little sisters were attacked by hollows, and I defended them. It might not be rational, but it was the right thing to do. But if you died for them, what purpose would it serve?" Quote. Ichigo glared. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that a big brother protects their younger siblings. You don't think about your own danger. You just think about the goal. My goal is to protect my friends and my family." He hadn't realized how loud his voice was getting, but a number of heads had turned to watch their conversation. Ichigo scowled and lowered his voice. "I guess you don't really care about anything like that." Sosuke inhaled slowly. "No one has ever," he stopped. "There has never been anyone in my life worth caring for." Ichigo couldn't take it anymore. "Well, I guess I'm not rational. I guess I'm willing to throw away everything I've ever known to try to." He fell silent. "To save the world from someone who was willing to destroy it. Someone who was willing to kill my family and friends and everyone I've ever known," he thought. Sosuke gazed at him with huge brown eyes that for once seemed to have some kind of emotion in them. He was probably putting on another act. Ichigo stomped away. Chapter 4. The afternoon sun lay in dusty golden swaths over the academy courtyard. It was likely one of the last pleasant days of fall, and the students were taking full advantage. Groups sprawled across the few small patches of grass, snoozing or studying. A few had decided to climb the old oak tree in the center of the courtyard. Others clustered around the battered wooden tables in the east corner, sharing juice, sake, and loud conversation. Ichigo lay on the grass, a book covering his face, letting the words of the passers-by wash over him as he dozed. "Did you hear what happened to Mitsuru?" Quote. "What?" Quote. He got attacked by a hollow and almost killed. What? How? Is he gonna be okay? Quote. Yeah, he's in the Squad 4 hospital now. It's kind of strange. He was out in the forest, and he must have had some hollow bait. Don't know how he got a hold of it, but he was in a clearing with a small cage. The voice was scornful. Don't know how he thought he could trap a hollow in a cage. Anyway, the hollow bait performed as expected, and several of them were attracted to the idiot, whom they then proceeded to smash into bits. It's lucky for him one of the Squad 9 patrols happened to be passing by. What was he doing out in the forest? Quote. He won't say. He claims he didn't know about the hollow bait. He must be lying, of course. And when he was questioned he insisted that he had been there with another student. He snorted. But it turns out that other student was taking a test at that very same time. So clearly he was doing something he wasn't supposed to. The students moved away, still talking, and their comments gradually faded away. Ichigo thought dimly that he should get up, that there was something he should be doing, but he was so drowsy, there was nothing around him but the muted buzz of the crowd of students talking, and it was warm and pleasant. Ichigo woke with a start. The air was cooling rapidly, and most of the students were gone. He hadn't meant to doze off. Judging by the angle of the sun, he had missed his last class. He got up and gathered his belongings quickly. He hesitated, glancing in the direction of his classroom building, wondering if it would be worthwhile to walk in 45 minutes late. Then he shook his head and headed in the opposite direction. He strode through the gathering darkness in the streets of Sariniste. A brisk wind nipped at his heels, blowing his hair into his face and swirling his robes. The air was redolent with the winey scent of autumn leaves. He took a brief glance around. No one was in sight. He gave a quick bound and landed lightly on a neighboring rooftop. He crouched, practicing hiding his ryotsu. Below him ran one of the main thoroughfares of the Sariniste, not far from the academy gate, and he had an excellent vantage point of all the students just leaving their final classes, walking to the dorms only a block or so away. He watched them as they headed home in clumps, laughing and chattering. One student, though, walked alone. Sosuke plodded head down, his nose buried in a book. He shuffled slowly along the darkening street, his dark head bent, every now and then turning a page. Ichigo shook his head. For someone who would become hyper-cautious as an adult, he certainly was completely oblivious to his surroundings and unaware of any danger. And from where Ichigo was standing, he could see a student in a 6th-year uniform waiting just behind an alley wall up ahead. He was holding something in his hands, but Ichigo was too far away to see what it was. He frowned. In just a few weeks at the academy he had already noticed that Sosuke never went out drinking with other students or joined in any of the various athletic competitions, preferring instead to focus on relentless practice in the Shinigami arts or reading. As a result, he appeared to be almost completely isolated. The combination of isolation and his academic prowess had made him a target for bullies, and it looked like one was lying in wait for him. Ichigo squinted. Something about the waiting student's movements looked familiar. The youth shifted and Ichigo saw the flash of a toothy grin. He sighed. What was Hiriko Shinji doing picking on little Sosuke? He didn't think his friend was really the bully type. The boy below continued his slow, irregular approach. Every now and then he paused, riveted by some fascinating piece of knowledge in his book. With one thin finger, he pushed his new pair of glasses up his nose. Ichigo wondered briefly where he had gotten the money to buy them. Sosuke turned another page. Ichigo debated with himself whether he should warn him. But surely Shinji was not a true bully, and would do nothing to harm the younger boy. Still, Ichigo crept closer, ducking behind a balustrade, cautiously raising his head to peer out from behind it. The boy was almost abeam the corner where Shinji was secreted. Ichigo heard Sosuke's sandals scuffing through the gravel. The hem of his slightly too long robes dragged in the dirt. As he passed the corner, the older student jumped on him in a flash, and Ichigo saw what he was holding: a couple of pie tins filled with whipping or shaving cream. One after another the pies sailed, hitting the smaller boy in the face and shoulders, spattering pale white cream all over his face and down his uniform, knocking the book out of his hands to fall face down in the dust. Shinji doubled over with laughter, slapping his thighs. "Ha, Aizen. Good one, huh? I got ya that time." Quote. There was utter calm on Sosuke's face as the boy completely ignored Shinji, slowly wiped his eyes with 2 fingers, and shook the cream off his hands. With a corner of his robe he wiped the rest of his face clean. He picked up his book, the pages coated with white goo and dust, and attempted to wipe it dry with another section of his robes. "Hey Aizen!" shouted Shinji. "Y'all really oughta pay more attention to our surroundings. What if it had been a hollow?" A good Shinigami is always alert. Sosuke said nothing. He picked up his glasses and tried to wipe them clean without much success. "Hey, come on, say something," called Shinji. "Ya know, you'll really be happier if y'all learn to laugh at jokes, even if they're on you." Sosuke raised his dark head and gave Shinji a penetrating stare. He made no reply, but brushed past the older boy, walking faster now as he headed toward his dorm room, holding the book with 2 fingers. "Sheesh," called Shinji after him, "at least, say something. Are y'all mad? Do y'all want me to stop?" When he received no response, he shook his head and muttered to himself, "That Aizen kid sure is creepy." Ichigo jumped down from the roof and landed lightly in front of him. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, folding his arms and scowling. Shinji spun to face him, grinning his toothy smile. "Oh, hey, Carrot Top," he greeted Ichigo. "Or should I say Strawberry Top?" Quote. "Shut up," said Ichigo without heat. "Why'd you do that to him? Did he ever do anything to you?" Quote. Shinji gave him an incredulous look. "Yeah. Acted creepy is what he did. Something's off about that kid. Didn't you see how he stared at me with that dead fish kinda look?" Quote. "You attacked him. It was a harmless prank. He needs to lighten up, learn not to take himself so seriously. He acts like he's some kind of god or something. You messed up his book and maybe his glasses, and definitely made a big mess of his robes," Ichigo pointed out. "Not altogether harmless. Although, at least whipping cream is kind of tasty, sweet and rich. Sosuke could use some fattening up, he's way too thin." Shinji looked offended. "What? Whipping cream? Waste good stuff on that kid?" "Nah, it was shaving cream. Costs much less." Ichigo shook his head. "Hundreds of thousands of people will die one day because you're cheap." Huh? Quote. "Never mind." Shinji continued defensively, "Besides, it's educational. Pranks are fun, they teach you to laugh at yourself. I'm training him to be a better person. Isn't that what a teacher does?" Quote. "Some people might think it was kind of mean-spirited." "Ah, where's your sense of fun?" Shinji laughed. "Shinji, he's 12 years old," retorted Ichigo. "But he's already a hopeless nerd." Quote. Ichigo only shook his head. The other shrugged, picked up his empty pie tins and sauntered up the street in the direction of the sixth-year dorms. Ichigo regarded him with annoyance. Shinji really didn't get how much Sosuke was bothered by his actions. The two were like oil and water. Shinji had passed the street lamp at the end of the block when it happened. Ichigo's head whipped up as he sensed something amiss, and Shinji snapped to alertness as well. It was a Kido trap, a spell that had been left on the street and was set to be triggered by a person walking over it. A cage of black spears of energy appeared all around Shinji. It snapped shut around him, piercing lances emerging on all sides. He cried out hoarsely as the spears penetrated his body, splashing blood against the wall. Ichigo ran down the street, shouting to a passerby to run to Squad 4 for a medic. He fell to his knees beside Shinji, lying senseless on the gravel. Blood leaked out from multiple wounds and pooled in the dirt. Ichigo's healing abilities were minimal, but he knew enough first aid from his work in the clinic that he could attempt to stop the bleeding. He tore off strips of cloth from his own robes and began to bind Shinji's wounds. Come on," he muttered under his breath, "you're too much of a jerk to die." He looked up with relief at the sight of several healers converging on them. Quickly and efficiently they healed the worst of Shinji's wounds, loaded him up on a stretcher, and ran off to the hospital. A pair of city patrollers arrived to question potential witnesses. Ichigo heard one man describing a pale, overweight kid in a Shinigami Academy uniform who had been seen scurrying away from the scene. Another officer carefully scraped the remnants of the Kido trap into a sealed container. Ichigo couldn't help wondering where Sosuke had been, but he certainly had neither seen him nearby nor detected any Reiatsu traces. Later, he heard several of the students laughing about how Sosuke had come into the dorm all sticky from the cream and had spent a couple of hours bathing and washing his clothes. Everyone remembered exactly where he had been during the time the Kido trap had been sprung. It was a perfect alibi. It was announced the next day that they had caught the culprit the eyewitnesses had seen and had matched him to Reiatsu traces on the trap itself. It was the young noble in their class, Omaeda Takeo. XXXXXXX. Hiriko senpai is going to be okay, right? Quote. Yeah. He's supposed to make a full recovery. Good thing they caught that bastard Takeo. Did they ever find out why he did it? Asked the first student. The other student shrugged. Hiriko senpai was a teaching assistant for his class. Maybe Takeo didn't like his grade. He paused. Do you know how they figured out it was him? Quote. The first student laughed. The idiot left his Reiatsu signature all over the spell. Wasn't smart enough to even try hiding it. The second speaker shook his head. Pretty dumb. He didn't even create the spell, he bought it at this sleazy dive in Lower Sariniste. They found cash with his Reiatsu on it in the till. The second speaker whistled. Just stupid. And brazen. The kid kept denying it, insisting on this really stupid alibi, claiming he was at a bar with a dozen other people. He shook his head. But somehow none of them remembered Takeo being there that night. Plus 2 eyewitnesses put him running away from the scene of the crime. The second student rolled his eyes. I hear he kept trying to get his family to bail him out. But attempted murder is a serious enough crime that even noble blood can't get you off. What's going to happen to him? Quote. Scheduled for execution, what do you expect? Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Ichigo parried a blow from Sosuke's sword and leapt backwards. You know, it's kind of strange, he panted, as he jumped sideways to evade another blow and attacked, that of the 3 kids who bullied you, 2 are in the hospital, and 1 is in jail for putting one of the others in the hospital. Sosuke spun his blade and ducked under Ichigo's guard, stopping a hair's breadth from his throat. Point to me, he called, withdrawing the blade as they disengaged. And what do you mean, strange? That it might be some sort of divine retribution, evildoers receiving their just deserts. He shrugged. I don't believe in that. I think it was just bad luck on their part. Bad luck. Or, Ichigo said slowly, the results of a carefully laid plan. He eyed Sosuke closely, but could see no betraying glimmer in the other's eyes. What are you saying? Sosuke asked mildly. It seems too convenient to be true. I'm wondering if you had anything to do with it. Sosuke's eyes widened. Me? How could that be? I wasn't anywhere near any of them, and I thought the evidence was quite clear. Said Ichigo. Maybe somebody could have manipulated events, tampered with the evidence. I saw the report. Somebody would have also managed to convince about 20 witnesses to lie about what they had seen. He smiled. Very unlikely. Ichigo stared at him. It had all the hallmarks of Kyoka Suigetsu and one of Aizen's convoluted plans, from the way he had appeared so oblivious while reading that book to the multiple witnesses establishing all the key players at the appropriate scenes. He was about to burst out with what he knew about absolute hypnosis and Aizen's Zanpakuto, but then he stopped. One corner of his mouth twitched. Sosuke's attitude must be rubbing off on him after all the time they had spent together. Instead of just blurting out the truth, he was stopping and considering the consequences of his actions. If he told Sosuke exactly what he knew, his cover would be blown and his mission would be in danger. But what if he came up with an alternative explanation for how he knew? I've never told you about the true power of my Zanpakuto, he began slowly, and was gratified to see Sosuke's eyes widen. I've told everybody that it's simply an extraordinarily strong melee weapon. But it has an additional power. The ability to sense someone's heart in their weapon. He paused, making sure he had Sosuke's full attention. This includes sensing and understanding their Zanpakuto's abilities. Sosuke said softly, I thought all Shinigami had the ability to sense another's feelings to some extent. But it only works if you are on more or less the same level as your opponent. And I've never heard of being able to sense a Zanpakuto's abilities. His eyes narrowed and Ichigo sensed his Reiatsu heaving beneath his strict control. Ichigo shrugged. New abilities are discovered all the time. He held Sosuke's eyes with his, felt his active mind churning with thoughts, ideas, plans. Besides, I think we are on the same level. Are we? Sosuke asked quietly. His voice had become eerily calm. Ichigo nodded, then hesitated. Everyone in the academy had been so flabbergasted that a couple of first-year students already knew the names of their Zanpakutos that they hadn't questioned either of them or tried to analyze their powers in more detail. So as far as he could tell, this idea for the power of his sword wasn't implausible. I can sense that your Zan isn't water-based, like you've told everyone. It has another, stronger power. He paused, his own sword hanging loose in his hand. How would Sosuke react to learning that someone else could see right through his power? Would he consider him a threat? Maybe, but Ichigo decided to just go for it. Your sword is an illusion based on Pakuto. You can control the senses of anyone you wish in any possible way. That could easily include fooling witnesses into thinking they saw something they didn't. Sosuke's eyes narrowed. No one would believe in such a fantastic power. Ichigo waved his hand. Don't worry. I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm just letting you know that I know what it is. And personally, I think it's a cool power. And bullies need to be taught a lesson. He took a deep breath. But you're overdoing it, Sosuke. Having this incredible power is one thing, but abusing it is another. Shinji was being a jerk, but putting him in the hospital for a prank is going a little too far. And Takeo is scheduled to be executed. Quote, I'm not saying I had anything to do with it. But if I did, what of it? Quote. Ichigo was exasperated. Didn't anybody ever tell you the difference between right and wrong? Quote. Sosuke tilted his head. In a word, no. Well, you need to learn. Why? As far as I can see, morality is only a limitation on one's actions. Don't you realize that's a dead-end way of thinking? Humans evolved to be social beings. If you only think of yourself, you will inevitably be less successful than if you work with others and collaborate. Our strength, human strength, is in cooperation. That's a radical idea. No, it's not. I read a book on the evolution of cooperation, that came out in 1984, Ichigo realized. He scowled. But it doesn't matter. It's common sense. Sosuke eyed him with extreme skepticism. Can you prove it? Quote. Sure. Ichigo's eyes lit up. I'll tell you what. You and I cooperate, and I'll show you what it leads to. We'll teach bullies a lesson together. And it should be an appropriate lesson, in a fair and even fight. He glared at Sosuke. For example, it would be better if Takeo gets expelled, not executed. That's the right punishment for his actions. As for Shinji, Ichigo rolled his eyes. He really thinks he's being funny. What you've got to do is prank him back. And try joking around with him a little bit more. Sosuke's lips thinned with distaste. What Shinji thinks is funny is being kicked in the face by that fourth-year student with the two pigtails. Don't tell me you think I should stoop to something so crude. Ichigo grinned. Ah, come on. Wouldn't it be satisfying to smash his nose straight through his face? Quote. A reluctant smile spread over the younger boy's face. Indubitably. Then we're all settled. Ichigo lifted his sword. One more round. Quote. Sosuke gave him a penetrating glance. Very well. He saluted Ichigo with his green-hilted sword. But, are you saying that you believe my power can control everyone's senses, which I'm not admitting to, by the way, and you're not denouncing me to the maggot's nest? His eyes narrowed as he studied Ichigo's face carefully. Ah. That horrible place. Of course not. You're my friend, Ichigo said, and realized to his surprise he was telling the complete truth. He had started this task as a mission, pure and simple, just charging in without thinking. He had not expected to ever really like the man who had threatened the lives of everyone he knew. But getting to know Sosuke had come with some unexpected side effects. Is that what it means to be a friend? That you're willing to lie for them? Quote. It means you're willing to die for them, said Ichigo firmly. Sosuke stared at him, assessing his expression. Even if they do something you consider wrong? He asked softly. Especially then, Ichigo declared. Then it's your job to kick some sense into their stubborn head. I had thought, Sosuke whispered, that people chose you as a friend if you lived up to their ideal. That some people simply had the kind of inner self that nobody could understand, and if anyone could see who they truly were, they would be repulsed. No. A friend is someone you stand beside, no matter what. Sosuke gazed at him with an expression Ichigo had never seen before on his face. Confusion and bewilderment. Ichigo scowled. There was a lot more to it, a lot more he had no idea how to put into words. But friends could be family too. Sosuke was only 12 years old, just about the age of his sisters. His sisters were gone, but Ichigo was still a big brother. And what big brothers did was look out for their younger siblings. No matter what. Chapter 5. This is juvenile. I don't see how you talked me into going along with this. They were walking along a grimy, crowded street in Lower Sariniste piled with rubbish. Colorful, shabby storefronts lined both sides of the narrow road. Ichigo grinned. This is exactly the kind of experience every student should have. Up ahead he saw his target, a narrow window splashed with bright red and blue lettering. Suzuki's Joke Shop. That's it. Quote. Inside the shop, Ichigo scanned the crowded shelves. Sosuke hung back and would have looked uncomfortable if it was possible to see that kind of expression on his serene face. If it wasn't that Botox hadn't been invented yet, Ichigo would have been sure the kid had gone in for a few injections. He rummaged through haphazardly arranged packages. Aha! Perfect! Ichigo exclaimed. He tipped a small box off a shelf and waved it triumphantly at Sosuke. The boy sighed quietly but took it and went to the front counter to pay. Ichigo made a note to himself that he was going to have to ask Sosuke where he got his money. On the other hand, maybe he didn't want to know. XXXXXXX. Classes continued to be boring. If it hadn't been for all the training he was doing with Sosuke and the ethics lessons he was trying to sneak in on the side, Ichigo wasn't sure how he would have gotten through the year. On the plus side, some of the basics in Reiatsu control and use of Kido were ending up being very useful since his own training with Urahara and his dad had been spotty. Ichigo yawned as he entered his afternoon class on strategy. Shinji was out of the hospital and back to normal, and seemed to have taken over the class permanently as no one seemed to know what had happened to their regular instructor. It was still early, so only a few students were in the room. Sosuke was out of his seat, sprinkling some black powder on the teacher's chair. Ichigo's eyes widened. After their visit to the joke shop, Sosuke hadn't done anything to indicate he was going to play a prank, and Ichigo had eventually concluded that he'd decided it was beneath his dignity. Ichigo couldn't help a tiny smirk. Sosuke wasn't even using Kyoku Suigetsu. As the rest of the students filed in, there was some muffled whispering and giggling as the newcomers were enlightened as to what to expect that day. Shinji came bounding into the room. Okay, class, let's open your copies of The Art of War to Chapter 1. He hitched his hip up onto one side of his chair. All warfare is based on deception, he read. Now what does that mean? Anyone care to discuss? Quote. There was silence for a long moment. Shinji peered around the room at the students, all assiduously avoiding eye contact. Man, coming to class when no one has done the reading is always such a pain. Sosuke raised his hand, and Shinji gave a toothy sigh. Yeah, Aizen, you'd know all about deception, wouldn't ya? Quote. The boy's face was sober and formal as usual. The skill of a commander is measured by how well he is able to conceal his movements and capabilities from the enemy. That's theoretically correct as usual, Shinji said. Now, anyone else wanna comment about what it means in practice? He scratched his behind unconsciously. Hayashi. Don, ya think it's more honorable to announce her presence to the enemy openly. Quote. The burly student jerked to attention. He mumbled, shooting a wide-eyed, helpless glance at his neighbor across the row. Yeah, I do. We wanna be honorable, don't we? Quote. Shinji's fingernails attacked the back of his robes and several students coughed. No. Try again. Hey, come on, I know ya haven't done the readin', but this is actually kinda practical and useful for ya guys to learn. Anyone else? Can anyone say what the Shinigami Academy motto is on this subject? Quote. Sosuke raised his hand again, but Shinji ignored him. Anyone? He paused and wriggled his bottom uncomfortably. It begins, do not seek out beauty in battle. He let the words hang, scanning the class. Anyone remember the rest? No one said anything, although a few more students appeared to be choking and coughing. A pained look crossed Shinji's face as he bumped up against the desk. Unable to stop himself, he started rubbing himself on the edge. A student in the back row giggled out loud, and then smothered it. There was an outbreak of choking as Shinji, exasperated, dug his fingers into his robes and scratched with a will. All at once, his eyes widened. He glanced down at the seat of his chair, ran a finger over it, and sniffed the black powder that came off on his hand. When he faced the class, his expression was stern. Alright, who's the guilty party who's showing disrespect to their teacher? Quote. The students froze. One of the teachers had expelled a student for showing disrespect only 2 weeks ago. Several students immediately became extremely interested in their notes. A few tried to gaze innocently out the window. Ichigo saw Hayashi surreptitiously lift a hand and point at Sosuke. Shinji's eyes tracked the pointing finger. His face darkened and he sucked in his breath. Aizen. He bellowed. Sosuke straightened in his seat. Thank you for calling on me. He intoned, do not seek out virtue in death. Do not think of your life as your own. If you desire to protect that which must be protected, then cut down your foe from behind, he finished with subtle emphasis. Shinji stared at him for a moment, jaw half open. There was a long, tense silence in the classroom. Ichigo looked back and forth between the nervous students and Shinji's deadpan face. Sosuke, as usual, showed no signs of anything other than calm amusement. Then suddenly a giant, toothy grin spread all over Shinji's face and he guffawed. Ha ha ha, cut down your foe from behind, eh? His belly vibrated with laughter. Good one, Aizen. Ya got me good. I'm proud of ya. What was it, Ichin powder? He shook his head, still grinning. Class dismissed, so some of us can take a shower. As the relieved class gathered their belongings and began to file out of the classroom, he gave Sosuke a hearty clap on the shoulder, still chortling. I guess there's hope for ya after all. He turned and gave Ichigo a huge wink. XXXXXXX. A few nights later, Ichigo had some time off, and decided on a whim he needed to get far away from the city. He had the urge to visit the outer districts of Rukongai. Sosuke had come from Inazuri, like Renji and Rukia, but Ichigo had never seen the place that had produced several of his friends. He was feeling an odd combination of melancholy and frustration and just needed to get away. He had had a particularly unsatisfying conversation with Sosuke that day. They had been tidying up the training room after a vigorous session. "You did a great job with that prank on Shinji," Ichigo congratulated him, grinning. "That's the way you get back at someone." Sosuke picked up a polishing cloth and gazed at him with what almost appeared to be sorrow in his eyes. I saw he seemed to approve. "Don't you see, that's how to make friends, by joking and having a good time with them." "Shinji will never be my friend," Sosuke said. "He will never accept my true self." He finished polishing one of the wooden swords and placed it back in its holder. His hair was even messier than usual, curly at the ends and sticking out every which way, bangs flopping over his glasses. He lifted another practice sword. Ichigo scoffed. "Why don't you give it a chance? Give him a chance." Quote. "What happened today is meaningless and trivial. Shinji still dislikes me. He knows it's just an act." He stared at Ichigo. "If you knew what I was really like, what I was really capable of, you yourself wouldn't want to spend time with me." He took off his glasses to clean them and with one hand swiped his bangs off his forehead. One lock fell between his eyes, and for a moment it was so reminiscent of his Los Noches overlord look that Ichigo shivered. Once more he remembered what he had felt in Aizen's sword during the battle, the desperate yearning for understanding and companionship, the hopeless despair that there would never be anyone like him, never be anyone who would want to understand him. He scowled. "I thought I told you already. I'm your friend no matter what." Sosuke didn't respond, polishing another sword with a little more vigor than necessary. Ichigo already knew what Sosuke was capable of. But being capable of evil was not the same as actually doing evil. That was the error Soul Society had made and even institutionalized with the Maggot's Nest. Sosuke was as much a product of his time as anyone. How could he get the message across? And I wouldn't call it hiding your true self, but rather making better choices in life, or overcoming your baser instincts. Sosuke lined up the racks and pushed them to one side of the room. He avoided Ichigo's gaze. "I suppose it doesn't really matter," he said softly. "I have to go study. I've got some time off tonight. I'll see you tomorrow." He had walked away, leaving Ichigo staring after him in frustration. Hiking along the old road deep into the forest was calming. Inazuri was some distance away, so Ichigo was able to spend some time losing himself in the rhythmic and satisfying use of his muscles without shunpo. Night had fallen before he reached his destination, but there was a bright moon and he had brought a packet of food and a bedroll. He planned to bed down in the forest and resume his journey early in the morning. Just as he was thinking it might be a good time to stop and rest for the night, he raised his head and frowned, slowing his pace. He sensed a Reiatsu concealing field ahead and to the left, very subtly interlaced with a repellent, a spell that nudged him gently in the opposite direction. It would not have been apparent to anyone of lesser power, but it immediately intrigued Ichigo. What could be out here, in the forest near Inazuri, that required a Reiatsu shield? Carefully, using the techniques he had been practicing, he drew in his natural Reiatsu and furled it tightly. Then, drawing his sword, he slipped noiselessly through the trees. After a few minutes he found himself behind some thick brush. In the moonlight, he saw a large clearing up ahead. Ducking behind the shrubbery, he peered out between two branches, using his power to sharpen his sight and hearing. A small figure in black Shinigami robes stood at one end of the clearing. Surrounding him were about 5 or 6 barefoot street urchins of various ages. Ichigo drew closer and focused. A man in dirty clothing stood in front of the group, his arms and legs bound with keto ropes. Choking and cursing, he struggled with his bonds. "YTH, fuck should I do what you say?" he growled. "You're just a fucking kid, and I work for Rokuro. He controls everything around here." "I'm more than just a kid, I'm a Shinigami," said a soft voice, and Ichigo started. It was Sosuke. What was he doing out here, and what was going on? He squeezed further into the shrubbery. Sosuke's voice was gentle. "I think by now you should have realized that brute force is not everything. Sometimes guile and subterfuge are far more effective." He paused, eyeing the man. "For example, there was a theft in your village last week, a valuable sculpture stolen from a wealthy council member." The man sneered. "Yeah, so? What's that got to do with me?" Quote. A cold smile touched Sosuke's lips, not reaching his eyes. "I suppose I must spell it out for someone of your low intelligence. So, Nobu here is an accomplished thief." He indicated a small, skinny boy in filthy rags squatting at the end of the line. The child stirred and grinned, displaying several missing teeth. "It may not have occurred to you that a thief can leave items behind as well as removing them from the premises." Sosuke's lip curled. "I know where the squalid dwelling you call home is." The man's eyes narrowed. "There are so many ways to incriminate you. Someone could easily place a certain item within your hut. Then, an anonymous tip to your employer, and," Sosuke let the words trail off, eyes focused on the man's face. "They wouldn't believe it. I'm trusted." But even at this distance, Ichigo could see how the man's eyes darted from side to side and his voice took on an edge of desperation. "Perhaps," Sosuke went on quietly. "But there are other powers within my grasp of which you know nothing. I know you got Shinigami powers, but so does Rokuro. And he's got Shinigami working for him. You're a nothing. As soon as I get free of these ropes, I'm gonna kill you." Quote. Now Ichigo saw moonlight on Sosuke's face. His expression was placid, but there was a glint of emotion in his dark eyes. "A nothing? I think not." He made a gesture with one of his hands and Ichigo sensed a heavy Ryotsu flare coiling within him, ready to strike. It spiraled up and around him, building and building, filled with a violent malevolence Ichigo felt all the way across the clearing. The group of children shrank back in terror. A cloud of cold, dark energy emerged from the boy's hands, enveloping the larger man and splitting into 100 black tendrils that wriggled their way into his skin. The man gave a sharp, half-choked scream, and convulsed, the energy tendrils splitting again and spiraling under his skin. Blood poured out of multiple wounds, and strangely shaped lumps bulged under the man's bare skin. His face became oddly distorted. Sosuke smiled slightly, and made a twisting motion with his hand. The speed of the tendrils wriggling increased and the bizarre lumps crawled under the skin of his face and all over his body. The man screamed in agony and fell to the ground. Ichigo could barely keep himself from running forward, reminding himself that the older man had just made a death threat against a child half his size. The man gasped for breath in between ululating screams. He sobbed, begging for the pain to stop, and Ichigo's eyes were riveted to Sosuke's face, to the look of intense pleasure in his narrowed eyes. Could he have been so wrong? He had thought that a 12-year-old could not be truly evil. But despite everything he thought he was doing to teach Sosuke right from wrong, how could it come to this? He had failed. Failed as a teacher, as a friend, and as a brother. Just as Ichigo was about to burst in on them, Sosuke released the man. With a single flick of his hand, the Kido ropes vanished. The man lay panting on the ground, sobs shaking his body. He made no move to get up or escape. "Well?" The gentle, implacable voice went on. "Have you come to your senses?" Quote. The man shuddered. "Sorry, I'm sorry," he rasped through a throat hoarse from screaming. "You now agree to enter my employment, and swear loyalty to none but me?" Quote. The man hesitated and Sosuke raised his hand again with a dark smile, the power visibly coiling in the air. "No." The man gasped. "Don't. I'll do what you want. Whatever you want." He took in a shuddering breath. "I swear, to serve you and none other." "Show me that I can believe you," the boy said, standing very straight. "Display to me your respect. Kneel and call me master and lord." Several of the children in the ring shifted from foot to foot, and Ichigo could see an Adam's apple bobbing as one swallowed nervously. Choking back a sob, the man fell to his knees and crawled forward. As the boy stood looking down on him, the man bowed with a low moan, brought his face to the dirt and kissed the hem of Sosuke's robes. "I will serve you, young master. I swear it, my lord." Ichigo stared at Sosuke's face. Beneath his glasses, his eyes were narrowed and glittering. "You should know that I have left a small fragment of Ryotsu under your skin. It will observe your behavior, and will report any disobedience back to me at once. Also, should I so command it," his voice became a lazy drawl, replete with satisfaction. "It will release a poison that will mimic the pain you just felt." "No need for that," gasped the man. "Please, I'm sorry, I promise," he broke down and began weeping. Ichigo couldn't take it any longer. He jumped out from behind the bush and ran into the clearing. "Stop it. Stop this at once." Quote. The entire group spun to face him. The biggest of the children lifted a stick. "He was spying on us. I'll kill him." Quote. "Wait," said Sosuke softly, his eyes on Ichigo. "There is no need for violence." "What the fuck are you doing, Sosuke, torturing a man? What are you thinking?" Ichigo shouted. Sosuke's face was as calm as if he hadn't just been caught red-handed in a criminal action. "Ichigo, do you know what this man has done?" Quote. "Other than writhing in pain and screaming as you tortured him?" "No. He's the local crime lord's assassin, threatening and killing anyone who opposes his master's efforts. Oh, and by the way, he has a little side hobby that he likes to indulge in during his free time," Sosuke went on coolly. "He enjoys assaulting young village girls, like Hisana here. He prefers girls no older than 10, ideally poor orphans with no one to speak up for them, so he can do what he likes without fear of consequences." Taken aback, Ichigo looked at the little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, in dismay. "Is this true?" he demanded. Had he been too quick to condemn Aizen's actions as evil based on what he knew of his future? The girl shrank back, hiding her face behind a curtain of straight black hair. Then, imperceptibly, she nodded. "Doesn't anyone stop him?" Quote. "When it's his word against hers. Surely you are aware of the status of poor village children in Soul Society." Ichigo scowled. "But Sosuke, no matter what crimes this man has committed, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And now you're trying to employ him yourself. As what, an assassin?" He shook his head. "You should report him to the authorities." "To the authorities?" You mean, to the village warlord who authorizes his excesses? Quote. Well, why not to the Gote 13 then? Quote. Do you believe the Gote 13 cares about the peasants in the outer districts of Rukongai? Their lives are worth exactly zero to them. Ichigo had to admit he was right, based on what he knew about the organization even in the present day. Hadn't Miyuri casually slaughtered 28,000 souls in the name of balance, and still retained his respected position? Humph. Okay. He looked at the man still kneeling on the ground. But you can't just torture people, Sosuke. Quote. The man jumped to his feet. Yes, you should listen to him, Aizen-sama. You can't just torture people. Both boys rounded on him. Shut up. They shouted in unison. The man subsided. Sorry. He said. He raised a hand. But, can I make a suggestion? He turned to Ichigo. Maybe you should just give both of us a hug. No. Both boys said again. The man hunched his shoulders. So, I guess I should get back on my knees again? You're not going to make me kiss the hem of your robes again? He said to Sosuke. Because if you don't mind, that was seriously creepy. Sosuke rolled his eyes. Ichigo said, wait. I know what to do. He gestured to Sosuke. Bind his arms with Kido, but don't hurt him, he grinned ferociously. We're going to take him to someone who knows what to do with him. Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See you next time, faves.